Ukraine's president says he expects to hear more from Donald Trump about his call with Vladimir Putin later on Wednesday. Zelenskyy says Moscow is not ready to end the war after Putin only agreed with Trump to halt attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, in the hours since, both Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of cross-border air attacks.
It's not the ceasefire that many had hoped would emerge from Tuesday's high-stakes call between Presidents Trump and Putin, with fresh attacks on hospitals in eastern Ukraine and air raid sirens blaring in the capital. People here have little hope about talks between foreign leaders in distant cities.
I think this will be a step forward to a ceasefire if Russia really stops attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. But to be honest, I hardly believe it will be long-lasting.
This is unacceptable because it's obvious that it's aimed at weakening Ukraine and its army and to start a new offensive. That's why I think we cannot accept this under any circumstances.
Following the call, the Kremlin said Putin demanded that the West halt all military aid to Kyiv before a ceasefire could be considered. But speaking on Fox News, the US president had a different recollection of what was discussed.
Was there non-negotiables mentioned by Putin? It was reported that, I think the Kremlin media actually stated that he demanded an immediate cessation of aid to Ukraine in order to get to this multi-step deal.
No, he didn't. We didn't talk about aid, actually. We didn't talk about aid at all.
The White House has confirmed that further talks between the US and Russia will take place this weekend in Saudi Arabia.
Let's get the perspective from Ukraine with the DW's Nick Connolly reporting from Kyiv. Nick, Russia and Ukraine have now accused each other of fresh attacks on infrastructure since this phone call happened. Were any agreements that Trump got just hot air?
Well, certainly, Claire, this doesn't feel here in Ukraine like the beginning of the end of this war. This seems like basically Vladimir Putin trying to avoid saying no outright to Trump, trying to let Trump save face by giving him basically the lowest common denominator, the smallest potential concessions over these attacks on energy facilities, saying, OK, we're not going to attack those for 30 days. But we are, after all, basically the end of winter here in Eastern Europe. That means that, the political importance for Ukraine of those attacks stopping is going to go down. The Russians have failed with all their missiles to fully destroy Ukraine's grid. They've tried, but they have failed. And also, Ukraine is actually increasingly able to attack Russia's oil and gas facilities with its drones. So actually there's a win there for Putin. So it's not like he's giving anything up here for Trump. And there's just a real worry in Ukraine that this kind of appearance of a process of negotiations will then actually lead European countries who are supporting Ukraine to kind of take their eye off the ball a bit and to stop supporting Ukraine the way they need it, because there is no expectation here in Ukraine that this process is going anywhere.
Now, the Kremlin is demanding an end to weapons deliveries to Ukraine before any full ceasefire could possibly take effect. Is that politically possible from the Ukrainian side?
I don't think that flies, and I think it's because it's part of a bigger Russian push, right? They want Ukraine to be vulnerable. They have said all along that they want the Ukrainian army to be basically so small that it will be unable to stand up to another Russian attack. They want Ukraine to say, no, we are not going to join NATO or have Western peacekeepers or any kind of military force from, say, the UK or France on Ukrainian soil. And it is just very kind of apparent what the motives are. There is no universe in which Ukraine, with its much smaller population, much more limited resources, is a threat to Russia. This is about keeping Ukraine weak and allowing Russia then in the future, when the West is potentially more distracted, to come back again. So I think that is basically the Russians putting the kind of demand there for a full ceasefire to make a ceasefire impossible and to, as part of the blame game, make it then the Ukrainians' fault that Trump's plan doesn't come to fruition.
And Nick, as we've heard, Zelenskyy is now saying he will speak with Donald Trump later today to find out exactly what the U.S. president discussed with Putin. How do you see that going?
Well, that's the thing with Trump, right? Everyone is scratching their heads trying to work out what exactly has been said. We saw that with the example of an end to Russian aid to Ukraine, military aid to Ukraine, the Russian readout being different from what Trump said. Let's see what Zelenskyy ends up hearing from Trump. For now, it seems like Zelenskyy is on best behavior. He's not calling out Trump. He is not being as outspoken as he was in recent weeks. There's been a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians from the Brits and the French to stay on good terms with Trump, at least publicly, and then maybe be more pushy when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of terms of any kind of deal. So, yeah, that is the question. I think for now, the Ukrainians are going to play along, knowing full well that the chance of any of these things actually happening is pretty slim.
Thank you so much. As always, we've been speaking with our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly.
And for more analysis on this, we can speak to Rafael now. He's a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and joins us from Berlin. Welcome to DW. Now, this was Donald Trump's first attempt at directly negotiating with Russia to end this war. In your opinion, and from what little we know, how did it go?
Of course, there's been back-channel conversations between various interlocutors of the White House and the Kremlin in past weeks. But the Trump-Putin phone call indeed was one of the longer ones that American and Russian leaders have had in the recent past. I don't think it produced anything tangible for Ukraine. We've not come closer to a ceasefire and certainly not to a peace in Ukraine.
Do you get a sense that he's treating Russia and Ukraine as equals here? The treatment that Volodymyr Zelenskyy received is certainly a lot different from the one we're seeing him use on Vladimir Putin now.
In one way, that seems to be the case. Donald Trump sees himself as a mediator between two warring parties. The U.S. readout of the phone conversation essentially laid the blame on equally Russia and Ukraine for starting this war and for being unable to get out of it. On the other hand, Donald Trump has been only too eager to coerce Ukraine by withholding military aid, by withholding intelligence support, and putting the gun to the chest on the mineral deal. Whereas on the Russian side, Trump has been less eager, not to say reluctant, to impose any kind of cost on Vladimir Putin. I think there's a very personal bond that Trump sees himself having with Putin. He's said multiple times that they've gone through this witch hunt during the Biden administration, and now he sees himself as correcting past mistakes and normalizing the U.S.-Russian relationship.
But is he misunderstanding Putin's intentions in Ukraine, or does he not care as long as the war eventually comes to an end?
I think there's a parochial business interest that drives Donald Trump, and we've seen Vladimir Putin play this expertly, proposing mineral deals and normalization of economic ties between the U.S. and Russia. On the other hand, I think Trump does misread the situation on the ground. This both-sidism on the who's to blame for the war, I think, is one indicator that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian strategic interests, both relating to Ukraine, but also to the broader European security order, and of course, the traditional American interest in it. Now that seems to shift with Trump in the White House.
You mentioned the normalization of economic ties between the U.S. and Russia. Yesterday, there was apparently also talk about a hockey game between the two nations. What would be the implications for Europe and European security of Russia and the U.S. potentially growing closer now?
This attempt to bilateralize the talks between America and Russia keeps Ukraine and Europeans on the other side of the door. They have had little influence on the U.S. negotiating position, insofar as talking points are being used that Europeans or Ukraine has tried to sort of insert into U.S. thinking. What I see the risk being of funneling this bilateralism into the working groups, as suggested by the two readouts of the phone call yesterday, is that it would allow the Russian side to essentially create a format that allows Moscow and Washington to decide over issues of European security. And you can only go back to the 2021 treaty ultimatums that Russia presented to the US and NATO separately, where it's really clear that what Russia is out for is a wholesale revision of the European security order. And it seems that Trump is only too eager to use this bilateralism to boost his own standing, neglecting the kinds of costs that would be incurred on the European and Ukrainian side.
That's Rafael Loss of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks so much for your time.